I knew I had to go camping in the wide, unsettling forest on my eagerly anticipated trip to Oregon. I had no idea that this journey would develop into an unforgettable nightmare. I traveled far into the forest as the sun started to drop and discovered a remote location to pitch my tent. The air was filled with the sound of crickets and rustling leaves, and I experienced a sense of serenity. I lit a tiny campfire, which caused the trees around to dance in my shadow. In a clearing, I pitched my tent and lit a bonfire, but my tranquility was disturbed when a person appeared out of the darkness and sat motionlessly at the opposite end of my campfire. I made an attempt to ease the tension by asking whether they were camped nearby, but they stayed silent and kept their unsettlingly intense gaze on me. I was uncomfortable being around the stranger and had a bad sensation that something was seriously wrong. The apparition finally rose up and abruptly left, leaving me terrified and alone after what seemed like an age. Later that evening, while I dozed off in my tent, I began to hear murmurs reverberating through the forest. I was overcome by fear and had trouble maintaining my composure. Suddenly, I felt shivers run down my spine when I heard footsteps outside my tent. In the hopes that it was simply a passing animal, I dared not move. However, I realized I wasn't alone as the whispering got louder. As the tent zipper slowly started to open, my heart was thumping in my chest. The earlier individual reappeared with 3 more, whose features were hidden by the shadows. They surrounded my tent, their ominous eyes looking through the cloth, and I was overcome with panic. They ripped open the tent without warning, pulled me outside into the night. I cried out for aid, but my cries were silenced by the eerie calm of the jungle. In order to look for any valuables, they held me captive. My thoughts raced, attempting to come up with a way out, but their hold was too tight. A rusted knife with a shining blade was held aloft by one of them. Their voices had an ominous undertone as they chatted in low tones. I realized I was in their hands when the knife's cool metal touched my skin. I suddenly felt a rush of adrenaline and fought back with all of my might. I was able to escape, and I ran headlong into the night without turning around. As I raced, their ominous laughter rang behind me. A dim light that appeared to be a sign of hope could be seen in the distance. My ears were ringing as I sprinted in its direction. I got closer and saw that it was a tiny cabin hidden away in the forest. I was overcome with relief and knocked frantically on the door in search of safety. When an elderly guy opened the door and saw me, untidy and afraid, his eyes widened in shock. My attempts to explain what had happened were met with hysterical cries. He offered me a hot cup of tea to help me relax as he brought me inside. The cops responded quickly to the elderly man's call and arrived. When they went to check after I told them about the horrible occurrences, they found no sign of the cabin where I had been held captive. I've never been able to explain what took place in those ominous woods, and I still don't. I am constantly reminded of the evil that exists in the shadows by the memories of that night. I used the trip home from a job interview as a mini vacation by taking the leisurely way through congested woodland and on narrow roads. The atmosphere was eerie and risk-taking as the rain lashed down. At 1 a.m, I looked at my phone and discovered that I was still 62 miles from the next turn and devoid of any traces of habitation. I kept on, assuming that the GPS problem was only a short-term hiccup. But after a half hour of cruising through the pitch-black forest, I became acutely aware of a grave problem. The same screen on my phone was still frozen and giving me the same nonsensical directions. As the rain continued to pour, frustration and tiredness began to set in. I had the impression that the road went on forever and that I was lost in an endless maze. Ahead, an intersection materialized suddenly. I assumed the driver of a truck that was parked nearby would be having the same GPS issue. In an effort to acquire assistance or guidance, I slowed down. I glanced at the street sign as I approached the crossroads and believed I recognized it from my earlier journey. I turned with a sigh of satisfaction, thinking I had finally discovered the right way. But after another hour of driving, I discovered that I was still stuck in the middle of the forest. As panic set in, I became aware that I had taken the incorrect turn. I didn't know where I was, and the rain made it even more difficult to see the road in front of me. I noticed a dim glow in the distance just as I was about to lose faith. A motel was visible in the middle of the remote woodland thanks to a billboard sign that poked through the rain. I drove into the deserted parking lot in the hopes of getting advice or assistance. The front room of the motel was dark and empty when I arrived. I became uneasy because there was nobody on the front desk. I made the choice to remain and assess my circumstances in spite of the unsettling silence. I was ready to continue my exploration when I heard a knock on the glass. I turned around to see the truck driver standing outside, completely drenched. His long hair and beard were wet, and his eyes had a chilly, menacing appearance. He shouted through the downpour, requesting directions to a particular address. I apologized and admitted that I was also lost. His scowl changed into a smirk, which chilled my spine. He strangely bade me farewell before making his way back to his truck. I made the decision to leave the accommodation and carry on my journey since I was uneasy. However, I heard the man leave the building behind me as I was returning to my car. I heard his footsteps through the rain, and I felt his eyes on my back. Just in time, I raced to my car and shut the doors. The man approached my window and attempted to force open the door while gazing into my eyes with hatred. He was left behind in the downpour as I sped off, thanking my fortunate stars for the auto locks. In an effort to get out of the shadows of the woodland, I drove as quickly as I could. I eventually made it to a city and received assistance after what felt like a lifetime. The motel I had stopped at had really gone down months earlier, but the sign was still in place for some reason. I kept thinking about that unsettling experience because it served as a chilling reminder of the hazards that can be found in the most unlikely locations. I made sure to always have a backup navigation system while traveling in isolated locations after that night. Even though the rain made it difficult for me to see, it couldn't make me less adventurous. I made the decision to take on a personal challenge that I had always wanted to complete when I was 25 years old, a solo hike. I was inspired to try doing other things by myself after living alone for the first time in my life. Going on a lengthy hike sounded like the ideal goal to achieve. This was going to be my first significant path because I had never engaged in any outdoor hobbies before. I looked up a trail that was expected to take about 8 hours to complete online. On Monday morning, I left with as much food and water as I could pack. At first, the path was just broad enough for people to pass without walking on the edges. I wasn't really concerned about getting lost because it was clearly marked. The trail was muddy because of the rain, but I wasn't discouraged. I couldn't help but notice that the track was getting broader as I went along. Since I was aware that there was supposed to be a small path the entire way through, it struck me as weird. But I ignored it because I believed it might be a passing broadening. I worried since I still hadn't reached the end after hiking for 6 hours. My calculations showed that I had fallen 2 hours behind schedule. I acknowledged the possibility that I had gone in the wrong direction. As the sun began to drop, panic began to set in, and I realized I had to go back if I wanted to leave the forest before it became dark. As I went back over my steps, I eventually saw footprints cutting through the woodland perpendicular to the trail. I had never seen them before, so it seemed odd. I made an effort to ignore it, supposing that I had simply been inattentive on the ascent. It grew darker as I made my way back. Although I hadn't brought a flashlight, the moonlight gave some illumination. All I could hear was the sound of my footsteps as the jungle grew strangely quiet. That is, until I heard a different sound. On the gravel, there was another person strolling. I came to a complete stop in my tracks and peered into the shadows. Before halting, the footsteps continued for a few steps. Who else possibly be out there in the dark? I pondered as my heart raced. I called out a greeting, but nobody responded. I made the decision to proceed, but after a few steps, the footsteps disappeared once more. As I made my way back, attempting to find a route out of the forest, fear seized me. The previous footsteps were gone, and I was now completely in the blackness. As I staggered through the brush, it appeared as though the forest was closing in on me. I finally discovered the trail I had originally walked after what seemed like a lifetime. I walked back to my car, glad to have left the jungle behind. I viewed a terrifying news article 3 weeks later. In the same forest I had hiked through, 2 bodies were discovered. Although particular locations were not given in the news, it was close to the trail I had previously traveled. When I realized that I had been only 10 feet away from something evil, I couldn't help but shudder. My entire being was shaken by the encounter, and I couldn't help but wonder what horrors might have been hiding that day in the shadows. I'll never forget that hike, and it caused me to reevaluate my future solo excursions.